So large jump in initial and continued jobless claims in the first week of October. In fact, initial claims got up to their highest in over a year. Now, there was obviously some noise in those claims because of the effects of Hurricane Helene. But even so, what that means is that there's a lot of jobless claims out there, and a lot of them were due to factors that had nothing to do with the weather. There was a jump in claims from Michigan, for example, tied to layoffs from Stellantis. There was also another jump in claims from California, far away from any effects of hurricanes. And with Milton coming through Florida, we know that jobless claims are going to rise even more over the next couple of weeks. But it's more than just hurricanes. From a purely economics perspective, there's going to be setbacks in jobs and incomes either way. And while there's lack of clarity in the labor market, because of it, there's so much of these other factors involved, we do know that there's going to be a negative impact regardless. And it may actually be, aside from the hurricane impacts, there may actually be stuff happening in terms of layoffs. But while there's lack of clarity in terms of labor market and jobless claims and unemployment, there is actually more clarity when it comes to consumer prices. Well, everybody's talking about sticky consumer prices. They actually are sticky, but just in the technical sense, not in the sense of how the mainstream uses the term. When most people talk about sticky consumer prices, especially in the wake of the September CPI, which was characterized as potentially sticky and hot, which absolutely was nothing of the sort, what they mean by sticky is that inflation pressures are sticking around and being stuck longer than they should be. When what's really happening is that technically sticky prices are only now starting to reflect the underlying disinflation that people can't see because they don't understand the differences in speeds that go along with any big consumer price bucket. So we'll talk about the clarity in consumer prices in addition to the lack of clarity in the labor market. So Steve Van Metre, where do you want to start here? Should we start with jobless claims and potential unemployment? Should we talk about consumer prices? I know we'll get to both because they're huge topics. What do you think is the most important of these?
Jeff, I want to start with jobless claims because, there's this kind of idea that some people lost their job because of a storm and that's not important. And it is. There are real jobs. They are actually lost. And it doesn't matter whether it's an auto worker or a restaurant server, it all matters because even though there's this idea because of a storm that someone was displaced for a while, that the job will come back very quickly. Now, you and I both live in Florida. We're very close to the storm. We know that some of these jobs aren't coming back because the business is not physically there anymore. So that's a challenge. But the real issue here is it doesn't matter who loses their job or why, because their spending power is going to drop. And maybe it's transitory. Maybe a bunch of these workers will quickly go find jobs somewhere else. I kind of doubt that will be the case. But the real issue I'm looking at is the longer people are on unemployment, the longer they have less money to spend in the economy. And maybe at first we don't see an initial impact, but the longer people are on unemployment and get stuck there, yes, it does slowly backfeed into the economy, which is why when we see rising trends of continued claims, typically at some point, which we haven't really seen much yet, that you see a big jump in initial claims, and it all comes back to the fact that spending power has been decreased.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things you hear a lot is that, okay, jobless claims are up, but we can ignore that number because of what happened with Hurricane Helene. And I might be inclined to agree with that to an extent if we were, say, in the middle of 2005 with Hurricane Katrina, where the economy was generally just fine, or any number of storms that happened in the 1990s when the economy was legitimately booming. It has the margin of error, the ability to absorb something like that and just continue to chug along, where jobless claims could go up because of the storm, and it would just, okay, we'll take the hit and we'll just move on all along our way. We are not in any type of similar shape here. So even if most of this rise in jobless claims is due to the weather, in this type of situation, that adds one more black mark in an economy that has a lot of black marks already against it. And jobless claims and unemployment has been the primary problem that has gotten people's attention. Finally, the unemployment rate has been moving up for over a year. And now we throw something like this on top of it. This is not something that we should just immediately ignore. Even if it's not because companies are laying off, it doesn't actually, Steve, as you just said, it doesn't actually matter. It just adds more negatives to an already bad situation. But I think in one sense it's distracting because there were layoffs that went into jobless claims. We just don't know how much of an impact it would have had or there would have been because it was mixed up into all this hurricane stuff. There's actual layoffs going on in Michigan and apparently in California too, right?
Yeah, Jeff, and we're finally starting to see some of these manufacturing jobs that we know in the surveys are going away actually start to show up in the claims reports, which is really good because, not good from an economic sense, but good that for a while we've been seeing, we keep hearing that companies are going to lay off, but we're not seeing companies lay off. And at least now that's transmitting into the data, which suggests that perhaps the labor market is nowhere near as strong as people think, or they possibly weren't an inflection point, that all it could take was maybe a hurricane displacing, a few hundred or 1,000 workers. And it could be just that little move that just tips things over the edge. Because as you said, Jeff, the economy is not going in the direction where it can just absorb jobs or there's enough jobs being created elsewhere to offset this. That's the issue. We're hearing all over the country, jobs are slowly being lost. And then you hear companies like Amazon saying, we're going to pull everyone back to work. Employees say, no, we don't want to. If you don't think Amazon's hoping some of these people are going to quit over that move, I guarantee you they're going to do that. They're hoping that happens. And other employers are watching saying, hey, if that works, we're going to do the same thing because we want to get rid of people, but we don't want to be the bad guy and go out and fire them.
Yeah, what do they call that? Attrition, right? They're just going to eliminate jobs instead of just firing people. They're going to get them to quit. Now, Steve, what you just said is suggested that you're saying that unemployment, like anything else, comes about with long invariable legs, right? Because what you're saying is that essentially we've been hearing all along, and I've seen the same data that you have, and manufacturers in particular have been saying for many months now, yeah, we're getting to the end here. We need to start laying off workers. And we haven't seen it show up in things like unemployment claims. We have seen it in other places. We've certainly seen it in the lack of hiring, the JOLTS hires number, the household survey figures, the hours worked numbers, which all look pretty grim already. So we have seen employers take these steps, but we still haven't seen the evidence of the sustained and large scale job cuts. And here we get the first week of maybe that taking place where it's obvious this is happening, especially in Michigan, and all the hurricane comes in and clouds up the picture. But the point here is that unemployment has been coming all this time. Businesses have been saying we're going to do this. And so it shouldn't be surprised that actually they start doing it.
Well, yeah, Jeff, and then you get that non-farm payroll report from last Friday, and everyone's like, oh, look how great the economy is. And we kept saying, wait a minute, are we even getting an accurate picture of the labor market to begin with? Of course, we know the non-farm payroll report, the reporting on it. Well, when we get the further surveys come in, we know that number's coming down probably substantially. But in the meantime, I think one of the problems here for a lot of people is you have bad data that makes bad decisions. So businesses are making bad decisions. The Fed, assuming that we know that monetary policy did anything, but nevertheless, bad decisions. And then investors make bad decisions. That's the issue. You and I, we're not rooting for the economy to go down by any stretch of the imagination. We just want a more accurate picture of where the labor market is, because I think we suspect it's a little worse than what the data is suggesting.
It is not just us, by the way. The Fed officials, too, they have come out, the few that have spoken so far in the wake of the payroll report, and said, yeah, it's great that, it's better than the alternative, sure, but we're not buying this either. Here's one example from I think earlier today. This was Austan Goolsbee, who is the president of the Chicago Fed, actually sounding reasonable for once. He said, we've got to take the broad view. So far, I think the broad view shows that inflation has come way down. The job market has cooled from overly hot to something like sustainable full employment where we would like it to be. And here's the point. If we could freeze it right here, that'd be a lovely picture. And so the question is, can you freeze it right there, or is it going to get worse? And then he continued, if we got multiple months showing big positives like we just saw on the jobs number, I would alter my view. But I think people can take that too far from 1 month. So what he's saying is, again, very reasonable. We see an economy that's it's slowing down. We all know it is. Everybody agrees that it's slowing down. But he's saying, as it's slowing down, it gets right into that Goldilocks zone. And if we had the ability to freeze it right there in the Goldilocks zone, we would. But he knows, and we know, we talk about this all the time, they don't have that ability. He knows it's far more variable than that. And it's far less of a chance than that because it's a dynamic world. And we also know, because we talk about this all the time, history shows once you get into that slowdown, it doesn't just magically stop at the Goldilocks level. It gets to a point where it slows down and then just takes off on the wrong direction. So what Goolsbee is saying is that our 50 basis point rate cuts, yes, we're out there downplaying it right now. The economy's just fine because the economy looks just fine from a certain perspective right now as it is slowing down through that Goldilocks zone. And even the Fed is worried because they know it doesn't just stick there. They don't just stick the soft landing because that never happens.
Yeah, Jeff, and you've done a lot of research on the similarities between now and 2007. And I have a reasonable bet here that Goolsbee and the other Fed officials are worried about the same thing because they always talk about the trend. And then you get this one-off report. They know that the actual reporting of the data was somewhere, I think, around 60%. So the rest of the data is to come. We know the reports have been inaccurate to begin with. And yet all this excitement, yes, look, we got the soft landing. And Goolsbee saying, yeah, no, maybe, don't get too excited here, because we've seen this before. And that's the risk, is we might have seen this before, which would then set up, of course, 2 quarter basis point cuts, one in November, one in December. And if we do look like 2007, well, then you and I know it's coming right after that, which is a lot of big negatives in a payroll report. And that's the risk here. Yeah, would the Fed love to pause here? Absolutely, they would love to. But of course, they know the federal funds rate doesn't do anything. They know QE doesn't do anything. They just want us to believe all that.
What he was saying really, Steve, is that we need to err on the side of caution. That's because history shows that it doesn't just slow down into the way you want it to. The unemployment doesn't just rise to 4% or 4.2% or whatever the number happens to be and just stick right there and plateau at right where we want it to. So what they're saying is the reason we cut rates and the reason we're going to cut rates is because we know we have to err on the side of caution. But then that raises a whole bunch of other questions, starting with the one that we always talk about. What happened to the long and variable lags? Because if rate hikes work with long and variable lags, and if unemployment works with long and variable lags, and unemployment is starting to show itself across the board, then the Fed is way too late. They should have been cutting rates last summer and last fall, not this summer and this fall. So what it basically saying is like, look, we're cutting rates because that's what we do. All we have is a hammer, so everything looks like a nail, and we're just going to hope it all works out for the best. But by the way, this one payroll report, we've been here, done that, and it doesn't mean anything. So the payroll can be hot, it can look good just before the wheels fall off. And oh, by the way, we are actually concerned in a big way that the wheels could fall off. And one reason why, let's talk about consumer prices, Steve. Disinflation is not good news. I keep saying that over and over again. It sounds like it's good news, like it should be good news. And from an individual perspective, from an individual consumer perspective, it is absolutely good news. But the reason why consumer prices are falling off and the way in which they're falling is not good news.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Jeff, because you want to see it because supply is going up, not because demand's going down. And that's a real issue here. But one thing I do want to comment is why the Fed still wants to do more rate cuts is because they know they can't stop anything that's happening, but they need an excuse. They need to say, look, we tried. It's not our fault a hurricane or some other event happened. We couldn't see it coming, but we did our job. And that is, of course, the mystique of the Federal Reserve here. But yes, coming back to consumer prices, yeah, everyone's saying how they're not going down fast enough. But the reality is they don't go down in a straight line unless something just devastating blows apart, such as a pandemic or a financial crisis. So this is not to be expected. But again, it comes back to the issue here. Incomes aren't keeping up with inflation, so demand is going down. This isn't what anybody wants. Now, ask any consumer, hey, price growth is slowing down. They say, yeah, hallelujah. But you ask them about their prospects for a wage increase or hours worked, they'll say, ooh, not good. And that's the problem here. What we want is to see exact opposite of what's happening now.
As I mentioned in the introduction, we talk about sticky consumer prices. In the technical sense, sticky means something different. And it actually does help you understand what Steve was just saying. There is a variable speed, more than one, to how consumer prices react to underlying economic conditions. Again, the use of the word sticky in the mainstream sense is that economic conditions are being sticky, when that's not actually what we're seeing happen. The Atlanta Fed actually provides a breakdown between what they consider sticky consumer prices and those that are flexible. And but there's a lot of academic research behind this, and it goes all the way back to John Maynard Keynes and the original idea behind sticky consumer prices. And what sticky actually means in this technical sense is that goods don't reprice all the time. They don't respond to conditions every day. And what you find is a lot of surprising results. For example, household furniture. That doesn't reprice every month, for example. On average, according to the research, it's about every 6 months. So if goods don't reprice based on conditions today, that means that some prices are based on where things were 6 months ago, 8 months ago, even a year or more. And so by segregating prices between technically sticky and flexible, which are those items that get repriced more immediately, what you see is everything we're talking about. Flexible prices that respond immediately to changes in conditions, those have been negative for the last couple of years, and they're actually getting more negative again during the summertime. The stickier prices, or those items that don't reprice all that often, are now slowly starting to reflect the disinflationary conditions. The sticky price index is slowing down pretty substantially and in a straight line. It is continuing to slow down this year. And what that tells us is that the underlying fundamentals that we keep talking about here are being reflected in the CPI, just at variable speeds. So while the mainstream media and even economists will run around talking about sticky CPI, meaning underlying fundamentals, in the technical sense, what you see is that the fundamentals continue to be disinflation. And as Steve and I will continue to tell you, that's not good news because, as you said, it's about demand.
Yeah, absolutely right, Jeff. Because when you talk to people about sticky inflation, what they perceive this to be is some business owner every year or every 6 months or whatever the interval is automatically raises their price. Now, I've worked for a number of small businesses over my life, and I can tell you that never actually happens. There's not one day that, hey, well, this time last year we raised prices by 5%, so we're doing it again, or the CPI went up, so we're raising prices. But as you mentioned, this is a demand issue. So what you see in the sticky side is input prices are coming down. That's that more rapid repricing of course, input prices that shows up in the CPI. And then you're seeing the risk part, which is demand. So you come back to furniture, as you mentioned, Jeff. So say we're selling sofas and we've got, 10 sofas and we can't sell them. But what happens at some point, we're going to discount them because the new ones are going to come in. And that's where you see this periodic repricing is when the new model shows up. And a lot of people are more familiar with automobiles, right? You go in to buy a car and they say, hey, we got a deal on last year's model because the new ones are coming off the truck and we want to get rid of these. So we'll give you a deal to take one of those. You see the same thing. The new models typically come in at a higher price point. It's very rare, very unusual that a new model will be like, hey, that one's $5,000 cheaper than the old one. Doesn't really work that way.
And if the new models come in and demand isn't there for them, dealers are not going to cut prices right away. Even though demand conditions have changed, those prices will be sticky. Not because of underlying inflation mechanics or anything of the like. It's just that that's how the world works. Dealers are going to try to get the best price that they can for as long as they can. And only after a period of time will they say, uh-oh, we didn't sell those new models like we thought. Maybe now we'll start discounting. By then, you're 6 months down the road. And so what we're saying is that big chunks of the CPI do not reflect today what conditions are today. That's the flexible part. The sticky CPI is reflecting conditions from maybe 6 months or a year ago. But where that becomes important is that 6 months from now, the sticky CPI will reflect more and more of conditions that we see today in the flexible prices, which means that, as I said before, disinflation, which is not the good news.